They told me to move my boat just like that. The HOA, after 12 years of me living quietly in this neighborhood, suddenly decided my boat was some kind of eyesore. A boat I had carefully maintained and kept neatly in the marina for over a decade was now, apparently, ruining the neighborhood's charm. Can you believe it? But here's where they miscalculated it. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't about to let them push me around. So, I took a step they never saw coming. I locked down the very marina they all depended on. I knew things would get messy, but by that point, I didn't care. The trouble started with a letter that showed up on a Tuesday in March. For some reason, my gut tightened the moment I saw the HOA's letterhead. I wasn't expecting anything from them. I'd paid my dues on time and kept my property in good condition for years. The envelope felt heavier than normal, which should have been my first clue that trouble was brewing. I poured myself a coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and prepared for the usual petty bureaucracy. What I read was so ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud, though in hindsight, I probably should have taken it more seriously. "Dear Mr. Harris," it began, with that overly formal tone they always used when trying to sound important. "It has come to the attention of the HOA board that your vessel, currently docked at Slip 23, creates an aesthetic disturbance that negatively impacts our community's visual appeal and property values." I read that line 3 times before it really sank in. How could my boat, something I had taken care of for more than 10 years, suddenly be considered a problem? The letter demanded I remove the vessel within 28 days or face appropriate enforcement action. The real insult came in the next paragraph. They claimed to have received multiple complaints from concerned residents about oversized watercraft disrupting the community's carefully maintained appearance. Oversized watercraft. My 35-foot fishing boat, which I used maybe twice a month, was apparently threatening everyone's property values. I glanced out the window toward the marina. At least 40 other boats were docked there, some larger than mine, some in worse condition, and yet mine was supposedly the crisis. At the time, I was too stunned to realize this wasn't really about size or aesthetics. I walked to the marina, trying to figure out what had sparked this sudden outrage. The Florida air was crisp and clear, the kind of morning that reminded me why I moved here in the first place. At Slip 23, I studied my boat as if I were one of these so-called concerned residents. She was in great shape, fresh white paint, blue trim, gear neatly stored, docked tidy. Nothing about it screamed aesthetic disturbance. Still puzzled, I wandered the docks, comparing my boat to every other vessel there. Fishing boats, pontoons, sailboats, even small yachts that dwarfed my modest craft, many of them older, more worn, or simply bigger. None seemed to cause outrage. That's when I found Angela Brooks waiting for me in the marina office. Angela had been HOA president for about 3 years, ever since moving down from somewhere up north. Always impeccably dressed, with a strong opinion on how everything should be run, she carried herself like she was heading to a corporate meeting even when walking her tiny designer dog. "Mr. Harris, I am glad I caught you," she said with a polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I assume you received our letter about your boat situation this morning." The way she said situation made it sound like I was running an illegal operation, not owning a fishing boat. "I did, Miss Brooks," I replied, keeping my voice calm despite my irritation, "but I'm honestly confused about what the problem is supposed to be." She gestured toward my boat as if its flaws were glaringly obvious. "As you can see, it's quite large and dominates the visual landscape of our marina in ways that concern some residents." I glanced at the other boats again. There are at least 6 boats here that are larger than mine, and several in worse condition. What exactly makes mine different? Her smile tightened, revealing a sharper edge beneath the polished exterior. "Mr. Harris, sometimes the spirit of community rules matters more than the strict letter of the law. We're trying to uphold a certain vision for the neighborhood, and your vessel simply doesn't fit that vision." That line stuck with me because it basically admitted they had no actual written rule to enforce. Then perhaps the rule should be rewritten to be clear and specific. I told her, "As it stands, my boat isn't breaking any." Her tone turned patronizing, urging me to compromise for the sake of harmony. I pointed out that harmony starts with following the rules already in place. From there, The conversation spiraled downward. Angela began talking about legal options and enforcement measures the HOA could take, but my mind had already drifted. Something about the marina itself caught my eye. The boundaries didn't seem quite right, and the signage looked far too generic and corporate for what was supposed to be a resident-managed HOA common area. There wasn't a single HOA logo or any neighborhood branding, just standard marina operation signs you'd see at any commercial dock. I tucked that observation away for later, unsure why it felt important yet. Angela eventually marched off, clearly irritated that I wasn't falling in line. I stayed behind, spending another hour walking the docks, taking in every detail. Everything looked polished and well kept, but the setup felt a broken bar off. The longer I thought about our exchange and her vague answers, the more I began to wonder who actually owned this place, and what real authority did the HOA have here. They gave me 28 days to move my boat. Fine, I'd use that time to figure out exactly who had the legal right to tell me what to do. Something told me this was going to get more complicated than I'd bargained for, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might uncover. A week later, another letter landed in my mailbox with surgical precision. Angela was clearly following an escalation plan. This time, the tone was colder, sharper, and far less willing to pretend at compromise. "Dear Mr. Harris," it read in icy formality, "your failure to respond appropriately to our prior correspondence regarding your vessel leaves us no choice but to proceed to the next stage of enforcement." Attached was a threat of $500 per day and fine starting on day 30 along with professionally shot photographs of my boat as visual evidence of aesthetic violation. The photos were almost comical in their absurdity, shot with a wide-angle lens to make my boat look massive, and lit dramatically like something out of a horror movie about murderous ships. They were clearly crafted to make the marina seem menaced by my modest fishing boat. Every shot emphasized supposed flaws that, in reality, were nothing. What unsettled me far more than the laughable photography was the realization that someone had been prowling the marina, taking surveillance pictures of my property without my knowledge. That crossed into creepy territory way beyond normal HOA business. It made me wonder if they'd been photographing other residents' homes too, and for how long this quiet surveillance had been going on. The whole thing gave off a distinctly Big Brother vibe. I decided it was time to get methodical. Using contacts I'd made over the years in the marine contracting world, I pulled the county property records for Lakeside Estates and the surrounding parcels. That's when things got interesting. The marina was not listed as HOA common property in the original development documents from the early 1990s. Instead, county records showed it was owned by an entity called Coastal Properties LLC, a company formed only 2 years ago. The timing was suspiciously close to Angela's arrival and her sudden interest in aesthetic upgrades to the marina. The deeper I dug, the stranger it got. The LLC ownership didn't line up with the HOA's own records or with the dues we'd been paying of fees that supposedly went toward marina upkeep and improvements. If the HOA didn't actually own or control the property, then how could they dictate what boats were allowed to dock there? I started keeping a detailed list of these inconsistencies. The picture that emerged was nothing like the transparent, community-minded neighborhood I thought I'd moved into 12 years earlier. The next day, Angela intercepted me at the mailbox, as if she'd been watching for the perfect moment. "Mr. Harris, you're making this much harder than it needs to be," she said, her face arranged into a mask of false concern. "Just move your boat to another marina and we can all live together like civilized neighbors who respect community standards." The way she stressed civilized rubbed me the wrong way, like she was hinting I was some kind of outsider or troublemaker simply for asking questions. "If you can't point to an actual rule, I'm done with this," I told her. "The boat stays." I already knew she couldn't produce such a rule because it didn't exist. Her reaction was telling. Instead of citing official HOA bylaws, she leaned on vague talk about community expectations and standards everyone understands. When I pressed for specifics of who decided them, where they were written down, as she grew flustered, then walked away without answering. That moment sealed it for me. This wasn't about aesthetics or community harmony. Angela was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. Angela's complete inability to point to an actual rule or legitimate legal authority made it obvious this boat controversy was something she'd manufactured for reasons I still couldn't quite pin down. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to talk to as many neighbors as possible, both to gather their opinions and to see if anyone else had noticed oddities in how the HOA was being run under her watch. Most people were polite and sympathetic, but clearly unwilling to get dragged into what they considered a personal feud between me and the board. Bob Thompson, a retired accountant a few doors down, advised me to just move the boat and save myself the headache and legal costs. Mary Williams, a local elementary school teacher, was more open to conversation. She admitted she was concerned about Angela's growing list of restrictions. Last month it was banning garden sculptures, before that it was strict new limits on exterior paint colors and landscaping. But even she seemed wary of provoking Angela's retaliation. Then came the third letter. This one arrived on heavy legal stationery from McCoy and Associates, a law firm that apparently specialized in intimidating people into submission. The language was thick with legal jargon, clearly meant to frighten me rather than address my actual concerns. But despite the lofty tone and threats of full legal action, it still didn't cite a single concrete rule I'd supposedly violated. Instead, it leaned entirely on vague phrases like reasonable community expectations and established precedent for aesthetic compliance, which sounded official but translated to absolutely nothing in real terms. It was all smoke and mirrors, impressive sounding, but still based on rules that didn't exist in writing. That was the moment I decided to dig deeper into Coastal Properties LLC, because the timeline had been nagging at me from the start. Angela became HOA president 3 years ago. Coastal Properties was formed 2 years ago. Now, the Marina was suddenly a problem requiring urgent upgrades and stricter control. I don't buy coincidences, especially not when there's this much money involved and the drama feels so deliberately staged. McCoy and Associates, a broken bar. I started to wonder how many other neighborhoods they'd helped under similar circumstances. But part of me also questioned whether I was in over my head. Still, curiosity won out. My investigation into Coastal Properties LLC led me into a rabbit hole I hadn't expected. What began as a simple check on corporate ownership quickly turned into something much bigger and far more personal. After 3 days of digging through Florida corporate records, cross-referencing property sales, and chasing down paper trails that seemed intentionally convoluted, I finally struck gold. The truth was sitting right there in the state and corporation documents, waiting for me to notice. Coastal Properties LLC was not some random real estate investment group. It was owned outright by Hannah Brooks, a 26-year-old second-year law student at the University of Florida. Brooks as in Angela Brooks, her daughter, a daughter I'd never once heard mentioned in 3 years of living here or attending home meetings. Suddenly, Angela's behavior made perfect sense. This wasn't about community standards or aesthetic harmony. It was a calculated family business scheme, carefully designed to squeeze money from residents. Angela, in her role as HOA president, would create manufactured problems with community properties. Then Hannah's company would step in with conveniently timed, below-market offers to fix those problems. It was, in its own twisted way, brilliant, using insider knowledge, local politics, and property law to engineer a profit pipeline. I was both impressed and disgusted. How many other neighborhoods had they pulled this on? How many people had simply paid up or moved on, never realizing they'd been played? The evidence suggested this wasn't some amateur hustle. It was a polished operation, refined over multiple transactions. When I expanded my search to include other county properties, the pattern became glaring. Hannah's name appeared as the owner of common area parcels in 3 other HOA communities within a 50-mile radius, each purchased at suspiciously low prices from struggling developers or distressed associations. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern emerged. In all 4 communities, Hannah had acquired properties soon after Angela inserted herself into local leadership, either as an HOA board member or as a consultant. I matched the purchase dates against old newspaper archives and uncovered something disturbing. In each case, the acquisitions were preceded by some kind of crises, stories about safety hazards, costly maintenance, aesthetic disputes, or insurance liabilities that the community supposedly couldn't afford to fix. Then, like clockwork, a young problem-solving entrepreneur would appear with a financially sensible offer to take the property off the community's hands while promising cost savings. The local papers framed it as a rescue, a win-win for struggling neighborhoods. But looking at the ownership records, It was clear who really benefited: Angela and her daughter. What unnerved me most was how formulaic the news coverage felt, the wording, the concerns raised. Even the quotes from concerned residents all read like they'd been lifted from the same script a PR piece is designed to justify a predetermined sale. The timing was too precise, the language too similar, and the fixes too convenient to be coincidence. When the full scope of this hit me, it landed harder than I expected. I'd lived here 12 years, paid every due, followed every rule, done my best to be a decent neighbor, and all the while, Angela had been quietly running a calculated scheme to strip the community of valuable assets. This wasn't just about money. It felt personal, a betrayal delivered with a smile and a handshake at every block party. I decided to confront her before taking the matter to anyone else. Maybe she'd have an explanation. Maybe she'd admit to the scheme if faced with undeniable proof. I sent her an email attaching all the corporate documents I'd uncovered. The subject line was short, pointed: "Interesting family business you have there." 2 hours later, she called my cell. Her voice was controlled, but the edge of panic was unmistakable. "Mr. Harris, my daughter's business dealings are entirely separate from my role in the HOA," she said. The tremor in her voice betrayed how nervous she was. "This is harassment and an invasion of privacy. If you persist, I'll report your behavior to the authorities." The irony was rich, as she was threatening me with legal trouble while standing on the edge of a fraud scandal. I could almost hear her calculating how much I knew and how far I might be willing to go. I kept my tone measured. "Miss Brooks, I'm simply asking who owns the marina and what authority you have to dictate what I do with my boat. These are public records, not private secrets. Residents have the right to know how community assets are managed." Her inability to directly answer only confirmed what I already suspected. She knew exactly how damning this looked. She was trying to control the narrative before anyone else caught on. Instead of backing off, I requested a formal board meeting to address marina management policies and fee allocations in light of the ownership records I'd found. My email was deliberately professional but made it impossible to ignore the issue. The reaction from residents was immediate. Word spread fast that there were questions about who really owned the marina and where their HOA fees were going. Neighbors began approaching me with their own stories about questionable decisions and power plays under Angela's leadership. The picture-perfect image of community harmony was starting to crumble. Still, I knew this could get dangerous. Accusing the HOA president of fraud was one thing, knowing whether she had political or legal connections to fight back was another. If Angela wanted to wage a legal war based on made-up rules, I was ready to show her what an actual legal strategy looked like. But I also knew this could spiral quickly. The board meeting I'd requested turned out to be less of an open discussion and more of a staged damage control session. Angela had clearly spent the days leading up to it rallying her allies and preparing a defense, not considering transparency. The board was made up entirely of her loyalists, carefully placed through rigged elections and strategic appointments over the past 2 years. At the head of the table sat Jim Patterson, a 70-something retired accountant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He shuffled nervously through a broken bar. Jim Patterson, a retired accountant in his 70s, nervously shuffled papers in front of him, never once meeting anyone's eyes. Lisa Rodriguez, a local real estate agent who had clearly benefited from Angela's network and referrals, sat back with her arms folded, wearing a defensive look that left no doubt where her loyalty lay. Then there was Sandra Mitchell, an elderly widow who had moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago and relied heavily on Angela for companionship and social standing. She seemed bewildered by the discussion but was clearly prepared to support whatever Angela proposed. As I presented my findings, I kept my focus on Angela's expression, watching the moment she understood exactly what I had uncovered. I brought neatly prepared packets for each board member: corporate filings, property deeds, and a meticulously compiled timeline, hoping that seeing the evidence laid out in black and white would force an honest conversation about the legal and ethical implications. The documentation was clear and compelling, making it impossible to dismiss the link between Angela's HOA decisions and Hannah's rapid property acquisitions as mere coincidence. One by one, the board members flipped through the pages, their faces revealing growing unease. Angela, however, responded with the same practiced deflection I had come to expect, clinging to procedural technicalities rather than addressing the substance of the accusations. Even if my daughter does own the Marina, the HOA still has the responsibility to enforce standards that protect our property values and community character, she insisted, her tone just as condescending as in our earlier exchanges. Mr. Harris seems to believe that property ownership gives him the right to ignore reasonable community expectations and disrupt our hard-earned harmony. Before she could continue, Jim spoke up, his voice low but steady. This doesn't add up. The unexpected comment visibly rattled her. She clearly hadn't expected dissent from her own camp. I seized the moment. If there's no written rule, this discussion ends here, I said, knowing full well she couldn't produce any such policy. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had been pulled into what now looked like a private business venture masquerading as community governance. Jim's remark had cracked the veneer, and doubt began to seep in. The next morning, the situation escalated with a formal cease and desist letter from McCoy and Associates, this one far more aggressive than previous correspondence. It accused me of making defamatory claims, harassing board members with frivolous meeting requests, and demanded immediate compliance with the boat removal order, threatening steep legal consequences if I refused. The language was clearly meant to intimidate rather than address the legitimacy of my findings. What stood out most was what the letter didn't say. There was no attempt to dispute the facts I'd uncovered about coastal properties, no denial of the family ties, no explanation of the transactions, only threats from making the information public. That silence told me they were far more concerned about exposure than about defending their actions. Rather than beak out, I began my own counteroffensive. Using my business contacts and experience with regulatory oversight, I filed a complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, citing potential ethics violations by HOA board members who used their positions for personal gain. I also petitioned the county to investigate whether HOA fees were being collected for services performed on privately owned properties outside the HOA's control. These formal complaints forced me to organize my evidence into a comprehensive, legally structured narrative. As I worked through each document, the scope of the scheme became even more apparent. This was not an isolated lapse in judgment, it was a well-planned, long-running operation spanning multiple communities. The timeline revealed just how deeply embedded their tactics were, and how many residents in different neighborhoods had likely been exploited without ever realizing it. Every record I reviewed exposed another calculated step in the process, showing a level of coordination and profitability I hadn't fully appreciated at first. I couldn't help but mention to a few neighbors that I'd seen similar patterns in stories shared on HOA watchdog channels, where communities had faced suspiciously timed crises followed by convenient buyouts. Angela and Hannah's playbook wasn't unique here, it was part of a wider trend in exploiting community management for private gain. Digging deeper into McCoy and Associates only confirmed this. The firm had represented several HOAs across Central Florida during nearly identical property transfers. Their specialty, dressed up under the euphemism community asset optimization, seemed to boil down to facilitating the transfer of valuable shared properties into private hands for far less than market value. Their website even showcased glowing endorsements from boards who claimed these deals solved costly maintenance and liability burdens, a language that, in hindsight, read like a sales pitch for exactly the kind of scheme I was uncovering. Angela's desperation became more evident as legal pressures mounted and her support within the community steadily weakened. She started making personal calls to residents, warning them that I was supposedly trying to undermine community values and push for costly lawsuits that would drain everyone's pockets through higher fees and assessments. But her scare tactics backfired badly. Many neighbors saw through the act, realizing that she was the one who had created the very legal mess she now blamed on me. Several residents told me about her calls, describing her tone as frantic and almost pleading a proof that she was losing her grip on the situation and feared the legal fallout from years of questionable dealings. The neighborhood was more split than I'd hoped, but the shift was still in my favor. Many openly stood behind me after seeing hard proof of the family's business entanglements and suspicious property transfers. Others clung to their loyalty to Angela, some out of fear she might retaliate, others because they genuinely believed she had acted in good faith. And, as always, A portion of the community just wanted the whole mess to vanish so they could return to a quiet retirement without neighborhood drama. Then I uncovered something buried deep in the 1992 planning records of files I finally obtained from the county's planning department. Hidden within the zoning and survey language was a clause no one had paid attention to for over 3 decades. A 20-foot wide public access easement cutting directly through what was now the Marina, guaranteeing community access to Lake Harmony for recreation. That single detail changed everything. The easement had never been vacated or transferred, meaning no private owner could legally block access to the lake. Angela and Hannah's plan to turn the Marina into a private, profitable venture was not just unethical, it was likely unlawful. They couldn't charge exclusive fees, impose restrictive rules, or threaten to remove my boat when I had legal grounds to demand access. I spent the next 2 days digging into easement law and consulting a property attorney who specialized in development disputes. The law was clear. Public easements are permanent rights tied to the land and can't be removed without formal proceedings involving multiple agencies. Continuous public use for over 30 years only strengthened that right under doctrines like adverse possession and prescriptive easement. Without realizing it, Angela and Hannah had stepped into a legal trap. Rather than sit back, I decided to act. Using my marine contractor license, I applied to the county for an emergency dock safety inspection permit, citing concerns over the structural condition of the aging docks and the liability risks to the public. County rules required full safety reviews of commercial marina operations when complaints were filed, and my credentials made my request credible. Within 24 hours, the permit was approved, giving me official authority to inspect the marina and temporarily close it off for safety reasons. In effect, I could legally halt their operation the same way they had been trying to shut me down. Early Saturday morning, I showed up with bright yellow caution tape, official inspection notices, and a clipboard full of technical forms. In less than 2 hours, the once busy marina was wrapped in tape, its entrances marked with signs warning that access was prohibited until the inspection was complete. The visual impact was exactly what I wanted, and nobody in the community could ignore it. By midday, Angela was swamped with calls from angry residents whose weekend plans were ruined. A child's birthday party at the lake was canceled, the monthly fishing tournament was postponed, and several families with visiting relatives were left staring at a closed waterfront. The protected marina she championed was now completely off-limits because of legitimate regulatory action. Her attempts to undo my permit only showed how rattled she was. She called the county building department repeatedly, demanding they revoke it. When officials confirmed that my credentials and safety concerns were valid, she even threatened to sue the county for interfering with private property rights. The irony was glaring, as she was now using the same property rights argument she had been denying residents for months. Worse for her, every position she tried to take exposed another contradiction. She couldn't claim it was HOA property without contradicting corporate records showing Hannah as the owner. She couldn't say residents had no right to inspections without undermining her own claims about community oversight. Each defense she attempted only highlighted the fraudulent foundation of her scheme. According to Neighborhood Chatter, her lawyers at McCoy and Associates advised her to consider negotiating a broken bar. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, it was outright fraud. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about possible lawsuits, criminal charges, and organizing measures to ensure nothing like this could ever happen in any other community. That night, Angela's resignation landed. No apology, no justification, just a swift exit. With her gone, the HOA board was finally free from her influence. Still, I knew the real storm was only beginning. Once you expose corruption on this scale, you can't predict how far the light will reach or what other secrets it will drag into view. The legal fallout unfolded over the next 6 months with a thoroughness that was both satisfying and validating. The county's audit of HOA finances confirmed that residents had been unlawfully billed $68,000 for marina upkeep on property the HOA neither owned nor controlled. State investigators uncovered even more: wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and a coordinated scheme to defraud multiple neighborhoods through property manipulation. Angela now faced criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and violating the very duties she had sworn to uphold. The state attorney's office was building a case that could put her behind bars if she was convicted on all counts. Her legal bills were skyrocketing as she fought cases in multiple counties, draining the comfortable retirement she had envisioned into attorney fees and potential restitution. Hannah's situation was worse. She had been running unlicensed commercial operations while in law school, an act that triggered both state bar scrutiny and a university ethics investigation. She risked being expelled before graduation and losing any chance to practice law. Investigators froze her assets, seized properties, and dismantled her real estate holdings to cover claims from defrauded communities. Meanwhile, our own community began to heal quickly. A new HOA board was elected on promises of transparency, limited authority, and open oversight. I agreed to serve as an advisor on property management policy to help keep things on track. McCoy and Associates didn't escape unscathed. They were slapped with a 1-year suspension from the state bar, fined $15,000 for victim restitution, and placed under monitoring for conflicts of interest. Authorities were also probing their ties to similar scams elsewhere, suggesting Angela and Hannah had been part of a wider network. Personally, my vindication was more than symbolic. The HOA's insurance company paid me $22,000 for harassment, legal expenses, and punitive damages tied to the very boat dispute that had started everything. It wasn't just money, it was official recognition that I had been wronged and that persistence could bring results. Angela's assets were frozen, her home put on the market within 2 months, and her belongings sold off to cover debts. Hannah was forced to sell the Marina back to the community at its original purchase price plus penalties at a $45,000 loss compared to its market value. A legal clause barred the Brooks family from managing any community property in Central Florida for at least a decade. Under the new rules, the Marina became a genuine community asset with annual financial reports, better maintenance, and safety policies based on real concerns and not arbitrary demands or anonymous grievances. Property values rose, and prospective buyers were now drawn to the neighborhood's resilience and governance reforms. The day Angela's moving truck pulled away, I was working on my boat when her car slowed at the Marina. She met my eyes for a long moment, a mix of anger, resignation, and defeat, but we exchanged no words. That silence said more than anything. That evening, I sat on my deck watching the sun sink over Lake Harmony, surrounded by laughter, fishing lines, and neighbors enjoying the space as it was meant to be. The board had just approved a community fishing tournament, a far cry from the tension that once hung over the docks. If this ordeal taught me anything, it's that patience and strategy often beat intimidation and bluster. Angela learned that silence doesn't mean surrender, and delayed action doesn't mean inaction. The sweetest justice isn't revenge, it's seeing the system hold wrongdoers accountable the right way. Our victory wasn't just for me, it was proof for anyone too tired or scared to fight back that change is possible. Exposing abuse of power doesn't only reclaim your own rights, it lights the path for others to reclaim theirs.